brazen thieves invade a couple's home.
They were in our son's bedroom.
It took us a long time to calm down.
And then come back for more.
I never thought that they would come back again.
Not once, but 3 times in less than a week.
It was a very dark week.
Where will it end?
What if these men are armed?
And later, a terrifying explosion.
I was scared.
The cashier assumed that a bomb went off.
He started screaming, he can kill somebody.
And fears that it will happen again.
Will he be back? We just don't know.
Bold thieves breaking into an East Price Hill home.
Thursday evening, June 24th, 2021. East Price Hill, Ohio. Ken and Ellen Reed, beloved members of their community, and their kids are all out for the night.
Both cars were gone, and that's kind of unusual to have an empty driveway. I probably got back home about 9:15. I didn't even go into the house. I went straight back to the garage. I saw the dog in the window, and she just seemed to be acting a little different, but I didn't think much about it. Ellen got home just a few minutes after that, and she and the boys were inside.
That's when Ellen notices something odd.
It drives Ken crazy because I can come into a room and I can tell that something is in the wrong place. So I thought, the camera, it's normally plugs into has an internet plug thing to it, and it wasn't plugged in.
At first, Ellen thinks maybe one of their kids unplugged the camera, but something doesn't feel right.
She called me and said, somebody's been in our house.
Ellen tells Ken she thinks they've been robbed.
She said somebody was in here and somebody took things.
The couple immediately takes a look at the footage on their security cameras.
I looked on the app to find out who took that camera out of the wall. And that's when we saw the guy taking it off the wall.
It's shocking. They have multiple cameras, and what they reveal is 2 strangers invading their home.
They were only there for about 5 minutes. Our faithful dog, Granny Wendy, who was old and not the watchdog that she once was. She got up. That was the first thing we saw, movement in the front room.
She gets up and she goes towards the back of the house.
That's why we know they went to the back door. She wasn't barking, she was just following them, going, what are you doing?
The Reeds realize they must have left the back door unlocked. They know how the thieves got in, but who are they? The footage offers one important clue, a clear image of one of the intruders.
Does us a great favor of looking at the camera while he's removing it so that we can see him right on his face.
The suspect probably thought he was taking the footage, when actually all he did was take the camera. Criminals nowadays are fairly aware that there's a possibility that they're going to be recorded. Apparently, not all of them are aware that the video doesn't live in the camera, it lives in a remote location.
Whoever they are, it looks like these thieves are searching for anything they can turn into quick cash.
Picking up gift cards and looking through drawers. Their goal was certainly to find some things that they could turn quickly. It was a gaming system, a laptop computer, an iPad, those kinds of things.
But what really disturbs the Reeds is the blatant violation of privacy.
We saw the jewelry had been dumped out, and they were in our son's bedrooms and, rooting through things.
Definitely shocked, like, this doesn't happen.
The Reeds report the theft to the police, hoping the intruders will be caught.
I never thought that they would come back again.
Just one day after they are robbed, the Reeds get hit with more bad news.
Friday morning, my sister called and said, Dad isn't answering his phone. And I went and found my father dead on the floor at 89 years old. You can just imagine, processing a lot of things. Friday evening, we were gone for about 3 hours.
While they are out, Ellen gets a troubling message.
Ellen gets a note from a bank that says, someone's tried to use your credit card for $500. Is that you?
The Reeds have a bad feeling, so they rush home. And what they find is shocking. Their home has been broken into again.
They went into the garage and they got a crowbar and they pried open the basement door. So the alarm is going off. The dog is barking at them. But they're just ignoring all that. And this time there were 3 guys.
A lot of people overlook that the basement is a perfect way, in many cases, for burglars to gain access to your home.
But once again, the bandits don't seem to realize they've been caught on camera.
And they took 2 more of the cameras. But they didn't see the last one. So we got a picture of them.
And when the couple compares images from the 2 robberies, they're horrified. This is clearly the work of the very same band of thieves. And this time, they've come back to grab big-ticket items.
I have a music and video recording studio in the basement. And they got a monitor and an iPad and a MacBook Pro and a camera, a nice SLR camera.
The thieves also take a priceless family treasure.
They stole Ellen's purse, and her purse happened to be made of ties that her dad had worn, and he's gone now. So it was a one-of-a-kind special purse.
It's almost too much to comprehend. The couple can't believe they've been robbed a second time.
And boy, that was terrible. I guess I thought one and done sort of thing.
It's also scary. What if they had walked in on these burglars?
What if the Reeds come home during the burglary? What if these men are armed?
And that isn't the worst of it. Incredibly, on Tuesday, just 4 days after the first robbery, the couple realizes they've actually been robbed 3 different times.
We saw some slats in our privacy fence in the back behind the garage had been removed.
Inside the garage, Ken discovers that some of his power tools are missing. This is the only place in the house where there are no cameras, and he's convinced the robbers figured that out and came back for more.
No doubt it was the same guys, and they're being a little more cautious that time.
It's a brazen act, and it leaves the couple rattled.
It's fairly rare that burglars will return this many times.
It took us a long time to calm down that night because we're just, it was very unexpected.
It was a very dark week.
Adding to the couple's frustration, even after they report the 3rd theft, no detectives are assigned to help them.
It wasn't a high priority. It was just a relatively small theft and break-in. It just wasn't on their to-do list.
So Ken and Ellen decide to seek help elsewhere.
I had put a Facebook post, please pray for me. And the next day I got a friend request from somebody I didn't recognize, but it turned out to be the reporter from a local news station.
Bold thieves breaking into an East Price Hill home, not once, but 3 times in less than a week.
Once it goes public, the story instantly goes viral. And when the community learns that the Reeds have lost more than $10,000 in the triple robberies, they are angry because the Reeds are highly regarded in the area.
We started a house church. We try to be a place where the kids come to play. We have basketball in the backyard and a trampoline. Neighborhood kids come in and out.
Friends and neighbors rally to help the Reeds.
So friends heard about this, right? A guy gives me $500. These other friends start a GoFundMe fund for us.
And that raised, $12,000. It was pretty amazing.
And with all the spotlight on the story, police also pay attention, devoting more resources to tracking down the bold trio of thieves.
Detective who lives in our neighborhood came and was dusting prints and stuff like that.
Within weeks, police arrest one of the suspects. To the Reed's shock, the 20-year-old, who is charged with burglary in the second degree, turns out to be someone who had recently visited their home.
I remember some guys coming a few months ago, but they were strangers to us. And they just asked if they could jump on the trampoline. Came back a few days later, asked if they could play basketball.
The two other suspects have yet to be arrested, but when they are, they too will face tough penalties.
In this case, these burglars will face charges of burglary and theft, the theft being graded by the value of how much they took.
Ellen's treasured purse is never recovered, but they do get back some of the other stolen goods, including some that police recover from a pawn shop. The harrowing ordeal has forced the Reeds to make some changes.
I feel like we're a fortress now. Ken's put more cameras up. We've got one of those little Ring doorbell things.
Still, the couple refuses to be bitter.
What we've been praying is that the hearts of these young men will change so that they want to do something different with their lives.
And there's one thing the robbers could never take: this couple's giving, loving nature.
We'll still have kids in our yard jumping on the trampoline. We're not going to change because that's just who we are.
In Michigan, another terrifying crime sparks fears that the intruder will return. September 3rd, 2020.
It's almost 10 o'clock on a Thursday night in Detroit.
Gas station manager Nasser Ali is looking forward to the weekend after a long week. And that night, he leaves his store in the hands of his trusted cashier. At first, it's business as usual. But just before 10 p.m., a man holding an odd-looking box walks into the store.
A masked man walks in about 2 steps into the doorway and places a large box on the floor.
He bends over and then does something frightening. He has a lighter in his hand. Is this a bomb of some kind?
The cashier, who was busy with his phone at the time, was completely startled.
Whatever the man is trying to do, he fumbles at first. But then he sets the box ablaze and races out of the store.
The box explodes.
The explosion sends fireworks, rockets, and flares throughout the tiny store.
The cashier had no idea what this box was. He had no idea what was going on.
In fact, the cashier assumed that a bomb went off.
The stunned cashier ducks for cover behind the counter. He is terrified of what's coming next.
Does he have more fireworks outside in the car?
Will he be back? We just don't know.
The cashier calls his boss immediately.
Nasser is spending time with friends when he gets the frantic call.
So I answered the phone, and as soon as I picked up, he started screaming. He's like, Ali, there's a fire in the station. There's a fire in the station. He wants to leave. He asked me, what should I do? And I told him to call the cops.
Nasser checks the security footage from his phone.
As soon as I seen the video, I was scared because you can't see nothing in the store. It was all just fire.
What if that fire is not put out in time?
Well, I just pick up my keys and start driving there,
Nasser races to the gas station.
I was just like flying here on the freeway. I was watching it when I was on my way. I seen a lot of smoke, but I wasn't expecting a big fire,
He arrives within minutes, before the police can even get there, and finds his shaken employee outside.
He was sitting on the side of the building. He was scared. As soon as he opened the door, there was a lot of smoking coming out, you know?
The two men quickly get to work.
We have a fire extinguisher. As soon as we came in, we tried to use them to stop the fire. And then the cops came over a minute or two after I came in. The cops, they came, they have a couple fire extinguishers too. Even the cops were scared. They were like, this is a gas station, you have to get away from it.
Luckily, the fire is put out, and the main damage is only to the ceiling.
The ceiling dropped. The ceiling lights, some of them fall down on top of the grocery and stuff like that.
The fact that the only thing that was damaged here was the ceiling tiles is somewhat of a miracle. If the sparks from the fireworks had gone out to the door and hit the pavement and there was gasoline on that pavement, it could have created a much larger explosion. The end result of this really could have been catastrophic.
The damage racks up to about $10,000. Nasser is grateful nobody was hurt, but he doesn't know why this man tried to light his store on fire, and he's afraid he might come back.
We don't know what else he's capable of.
The station can blow up, you know, because this is gas. Worst case scenario, he can kill somebody.
Nasser wonders if the fiery attack on his gas station was personal.
You know, I don't have no problem with anybody. If he comes to me, if he has a problem with one of my workers, I will solve it. I mean, I will do what I can.
As he tries to figure out who targeted him and why, Nasser studies the surveillance footage for clues.
I was actually trying to zoom in to see if I can know his face. I never seen him before.
We have no idea who this man is.
Police are also at a loss.
The detective, he said that guy has a mask on, so it was kind of hard to search for him.
In today's day and age, all bets are off because people walk around with masks everywhere, whether it's in a bank or a school or a store, anywhere.
Hoping someone will come forward with information, police release the video to the public.
To the media, on social media, to try to get whatever tips they can.
News outlets across Detroit repost it online.
For the investigation of criminal acts, the quick and real-time dissemination of video can be vital to gathering whatever evidence you can by, within seconds, disseminating it to thousands of people.
The video quickly goes viral.
Never knew until one of my brothers sent me the video. They're like, you know, what's going on? He's like, your station is posted all over.
Comments pour into social media, condemning the dangerous, senseless attack.
The vandal could have killed somebody.
But the only real clue police have is that it seems the suspect had a getaway car and that his crime was premeditated.
One of the customers, he was telling me that he ran outside and then his car was parked on the street.
To avoid anyone seeing his license plate or seeing what kind of car he was driving. It was very strategic and very calculated.
So he knows what he's doing. So he knows he's gonna put the fire and start running.
Even Detroit's green light program, meant to curb crime, did not deter this vandal.
Police departments, they come, they install like 5 cameras. They put green lights on top of the canopy. Most of the gas stations on the city, they have them. It keeps all the troublemakers, the drug dealers out of the, out of your station because they think this been watching, from the police station.
But this suspect, who either didn't know or didn't care about the green lights, is still at large. If he is caught, he could face arson charges, which can carry a penalty up to 15 years in prison and fines of up to $30,000.
Arson is against the law. One of the things that can certainly add to the severity of the charges is the use of some kind of accelerant, or in this case, explosives, and that is fireworks. So the criminal consequences are significant.
Nasser would like to confront the man.
I would love to talk to him. I mean, why would you do something stupid like this, you know?
And even though fireworks are legal in Michigan, he definitely won't be selling any.
This is a gas station, so there's no way we can sell fireworks.
The dangerous encounter.
Unbelievable video.
It's road rage out of control.
He's trying to fight us.
With innocent people in danger.
I got a kid! I have a baby! He just hit us.
It's just a recipe for disaster.
Knocked him off the bike.
Holy give me the gun.
And later, a friendly encounter at a gas station takes a terrifying turn.
Yeah, nice.
I was like, I need to fix this situation.
This is why they say don't mess with Texas.
This is a Thanksgiving travel nightmare.
A dangerous road rage attack in Texas unfolding in real time.
Hey, chill out, bro.
It's 2 days before Thanksgiving 2019. And 35 miles north of Houston, Texas, Interstate 59 is jammed with holiday travelers.
It was the rush hour traffic, very busy on the interstate.
Just before the Splendora exit, a young couple changes lanes. In the process, they accidentally cut off an SUV, and the driver has an immediate, angry reaction.
He starts to throw bottles. He's cursing, he's screaming. He stops even paying attention to the road.
The couple is in shock. Suddenly, they are smack in the middle of an ugly road rage situation. And even more frightening, they have a baby in the back seat.
One driver thinks that they've been wronged. The other driver is trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and I got to get my family away from this.
Alarmed, the couple dials 911.
Montgomery County 911, what is the location of your emergency?
Yes, ma'am. I am on 59, and there is a Tahoe stopping in front of me and throwing stuff out the window.
And now
they're speeding. And he just hit my car.
He's having a road rage accident.
Things quickly escalate.
He's trying to fight us and hit us with his car and stuff.
Actually swerved over into his lane, clipped the right front passenger fender of the vehicle.
And I have it all on video.
The couple is so shaken, they start recording on their phone. But that only makes the driver even more furious.
Nobody likes to have a recording device shoved in their face when they're already aggravated and irritated.
When people are engaged in road rage, when they know they're being videotaped, that makes them even angrier and even more impulsive. So that actually escalated the situation. He's hanging out the window, he's swerving across the lanes. He's so focused on this driver who's taping him that he's putting everyone's life in danger.
Now, things are really heated.
The drivers are yelling back and forth.
He just... Hey, chill out, bro. I got a kid. I got a kid. I have a kid. I have a baby.
This continues for several miles.
We have a baby in the car and they're yelling at us on the highway. Okay.
The 911 dispatcher pleads with the young couple to keep their family safe.
Can y'all stay in y'all's vehicle and not fight?
But then, things get downright scary.
He's just insane. And he just hit a motorcycle. He just hit a motorcycle.
He just hit a guy on a motorcycle.
God, he knocked him off the bike.
Holy
what the?
I don't know that I stopped.
Oh
he wants to fight us.
Man, he's trying to fight us. He just
I don't know if I stopped.
Right now, we're on the highway.
He just ran him over with being a road rage.
Oh, you're crazy.
He swerved across 2 lanes of the interstate and he clipped the motorcycle, which caused the rider of the motorcycle to hit the ground, flip.
Now, multiple panicked calls come into 911.
He's road rage. They just hit his motorcycle and knocked him over and over. Okay, man, listen to me. Calm down for me, okay?
A car and a motorcycle collision has just happened. He hit the damn bike, not looking, and hit him and fell, but they're all stopped here.
Both cars involved in the road rage pull over. But just when it looks like this situation might finally calm down, both drivers step out of their cars.
Now these drivers are out of their vehicles and they are face to face.
And that's when things take an even more frightening turn.
Give me the gun.
Someone has a gun.
That's a deadly mixture for a disastrous outcome.
For J.C. Burrows, disaster comes out of nowhere.
I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
He's just riding his motorcycle home from work, looking forward to Thanksgiving.
I was about 2 miles from home, 10 minutes or less to walking in the door.
And then, as he approaches an exit, he's blindsided. Caught right in the middle of the road rage feud as the SUV slams into him.
I couldn't avoid it. If I would have seen it ahead of time, then I could have got away from it, but I didn't even know that was even going on because they were coming up behind me.
And after he's flipped onto the ground, JC is a crumpled mess.
When it threw me off, all I did was ball up in a ball and just roll. When I hit the ground, I throwed my arms up to protect my face, and that's how I got all the road rash on my hands and my arms.
JC doesn't know what is happening, but he can tell that the driver who hit him is stressed.
All he kept saying was, I'm sorry, I didn't see you, I'm sorry.
With police on the way, JC calls his wife to let her know what's going on.
The fire department showed up, a bunch of cops. Then my wife showed up. When she walked up to me, she leaned over and tapped me on the head and said, "You scratched the bike." I kind of laughed at her. She knew I was going to be all right then. It could have been way worse.
Luckily, JC is okay. But when police arrive, they find themselves in the midst of a tense situation.
Not only did you have the people that were involved in this road rage incident, you have family members that are right on scene. And so very quickly, you go from 6 people to 10 people to 15 people to 20 people, and it's just adding to the chaos.
The 2 furious drivers who were involved in the road rage seem oblivious to anything but their own anger.
They were still going at each other. Neither one of them seemed like they were concerned with Mr. Burris, who was laying on the ground. We had to separate them.
Hey, back up. Back up.
Despite one of the drivers threatening to pull out a gun.
Give me the gun.
That fortunately never actually happens.
I think it was just kind of a scare tactic to try to get him to back off, but no shots were fired at anybody.
Still, the situation is clearly volatile. And when police try to talk to the drivers, they point the finger at each other. It's not until they look at the young couple's cell phone video
Well, I do have the video of what happened right here.
that they're able to piece it all together.
That video right there is very incriminating.
The driver of the SUV, Armando Montez, is arrested.
Mr. Montez was placed in custody for assault with a deadly weapon, and he was also charged with child endangerment.
And as the video makes the news and goes viral, there's a shocking revelation. It turns out the young couple were not the only ones who had a child in the car.
The couple screaming they had a child in the car. Police say so did he.
Authorities say that Montez had his wife and 7-year-old child in the car with him at the time.
We had no idea that there was a 7-year-old child in Mr. Montez's vehicle until we actually had been there for several minutes trying to sort things out.
There were children in the back seats of each of those vehicles, 2 fathers facing off.
The young couple who recorded the road rage incident is not charged. But Montez is sentenced to 4 years in prison.
He was sentenced in July of 2021 for charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
JC, the motorcyclist who got caught up in it all, is lucky to be alive.
Splendora police say it's miraculous that the motorcyclist involved in this incident survived.
I had to have surgery done on my right hand, so I missed Thanksgiving. Then at Christmas time, I had to go back in because I got a bad infection. I could not use my hands at all, and I was in physical therapy for almost 4 months.
And he thinks the sentence Montez got is much too light.
I think he got off real easy with it, and it should have been a harsher charge.
This could have been far worse. He could have killed someone.
On social media, people are divided. Many say both drivers should have been punished. But JC says the most important lesson for all of us is to never allow road rage to get the best of you.
It's not worth it. You don't know this person's got family and they're going home to family, and you could take all that away from them so quick.
We live in a crazy world where too many people do crazy things, and it's not worth it, especially when children are involved, and just too many things can go wrong.
In another part of Texas, when things get crazy at a gas station, an unexpected hero jumps into action.
Yeah, nice.
June 26th, 2015. Midlothian, Texas, just after 6 a.m. Firefighter Daniel Gaske is heading to work at the Mansfield Fire Department. On the way, he makes a pit stop at a local gas station convenience store.
Every shift, I stop there in the morning and grab a couple snacks and, a drink. Typically, my window in this gas station is no more than 3 to 4 minutes.
As a regular, Daniel has become friendly with the store clerk.
It's just, I got to know her from stopping in.
Usually, they make small talk and Daniel is out the door. But on this Friday morning, everything changes.
This guy decided to change it up a little bit. I was half asleep, so I didn't see this guy come in right there at the door. He walked in and I didn't even pay attention until he had his hand on me and moved me.
The man tries to shove Daniel out of his way. But why?
I was tense because someone's touching me that I don't know. And so I step back and look him up and down, who is this guy touching me? And I don't know what was going on in his mind.
And what this man does next is terrifying.
He pulls out the hunting knife. 6 to 7 inch hunting knife. I would say 2 to 2.5 inches thick and wide. It was big enough to be intimidating for sure.
Daniel is in shock. This is a robbery. And the knife-wielding man is demanding cash from the clerk.
He's telling her, hey, I don't want any trouble. I just want the money in the cash register.
This clerk is terrified. One minute she's chatting with, a really friendly customer, Daniel, who she knows very well. The next minute she's being threatened with a large knife.
But what this robber doesn't know is that the customer he pushed aside isn't just any customer. He's a firefighter, former high school athlete, and Marine who served in Iraq.
I don't like to think of myself as an overly intimidating guy, but I'm a pretty good sized guy. Most people, I think, would look at someone of my size and build and go, maybe I should hold off on this. I don't know who this guy is.
You've got to have a lot of audacity to shove past a man that large. And Daniel is a Marine, trained to have cat-like reflexes.
Also, being a Marine and being a fireman, he's there to protect everyone. It's instinct for him to do the right thing.
And now that he sees the store clerk is in trouble, Daniel isn't having it.
Instantly, I was like, okay, this guy already made a horrible decision by touching me, and now this girl's a friend of mine. So I need to fix this situation.
Daniel eyes the man carefully before making his move.
I take advantage of him not paying attention to me.
He's calculating. He's sizing this guy up, trying to figure out what's his best way to take this guy down. He makes note of which hand the weapon's in. Whatever move he's gonna do, he must maintain control of that hand.
And I go around his neck and I flip him over and take him to the ground.
As the frightened clerk watches helplessly, Daniel instructs her to call the police.
I yell at her to call 911.
911 is the location of your emergency. 9th Street, Midlothian, there's a robbery. Do you have a suspect? They got him on the ground. Please hurry.
With police now on the way, Daniel manages to keep both himself and the clerk out of immediate danger.
I was able to get the knife away from him and move it away out of his reach.
But this robber isn't giving up.
He started struggling with me. He was medium build, probably about 170 pounds at 5'8", so he's got meat on him. He could put up a fight.
Is the guy giving him a problem? We keep saying to let him go, but that ain't gonna happen.
It seemed like he was trying to go for the knife still.
This is scary.
Daniel knows he has very little options. He uses his own body as a weapon to hold this man down, and that has a lot of risk involved. You don't know how desperate he is. You don't know if he has another weapon. You could get hurt, you could lose your life.
But Daniel has this robber firmly pinned to the ground. And because of his training, he's pretty confident he's got this.
Before the military, wrestling was a big sport of mine. Going from wrestling into the Marine Corps, where they teach you hand-to-hand combat and to force your enemy to move in positions that are uncomfortable for them while gaining the advantage and getting in a position that's comfortable for you. So for me, the best option was to get him to the ground as fast as possible.
Still, there's no sign of anyone showing up to help Daniel. And he's been holding this guy for more than 5 minutes.
That can seem like an eternity. This assailant can get a second wind, and maybe he starts to panic. He wants to fight because he knows that he's about to lose his freedom if he gets caught.
Do you see the officer called the rough? I don't see anybody yet. They should be there any minute.
Where are the police? And how long can Daniel keep this angry robber at bay?
This is a dangerous situation.
As Daniel holds down the robber, it feels like it's taking forever for help to arrive. But he's determined not to let this man get away.
I would put pressure on his shoulder to where it felt like it was gonna pop out. And you do that to anybody and they're done. And I was like, okay, you understand, I got you tamed, you're done. You're not going anywhere. And he's like, yes, I understand.
This is why they say, don't mess with Texas.
And finally, after almost 10 endless minutes, police do show up.
From my understanding, the police were actually sent to a different gas station of the same name down the road. I guess that Otto sent them to the other one of the same name.
Police take the robber into custody and identify him as 19-year-old Dylan Bearden.
He was surprisingly a pretty respectful guy there towards the end. You know, he was saying yes sir, no sir to the police officers. To me, you know, had no intention of fighting back or running after the police got there.
Bearden is charged with aggravated robbery. And everyone is grateful Daniel was there.
They said, thank you, good job. Found out I was a Marine. Oh, okay, well, that makes sense. You Marines are crazy. You know, in a funny way, joking manner. And it figures it'd be a Marine that would jump on a guy with a knife.
After talking to police, Daniel heads straight to work, just as he'd been planning to do when he first walked into the store. And he modestly shrugs off what he did.
It ended as amazingly as it could. There's so many what ifs, what could have happened. What I do know is I thank God that I was there. I thank God that I was able to help that woman and help in that situation.
But everyone else knows he saved the day.
It's very possible that not only would these people have been robbed in this convenience store, but it's very possible that the workers could have been harmed or even killed.
And when police released the security footage to the media, he's hailed as a hero.
It only took a few seconds to decide he was going to stop the robber who just brushed past him with a knife in a Midlothian convenience store.
A 19-year-old shoved past him and held out a hunting knife about 5 inches long to the cashier. Gasky then managed to hold the man down until police arrived.
It's going all over the news, everywhere. People are seeing it and they're loving it. He's a Marine, he's a fireman, and he stops this horrible crime. And he pretty much saves this young clerk's life by his actions.
People were commenting on how he was a hero. People even offered to take him out to dinner.
But Daniels still downplays the whole ordeal.
I'm not anything special. I'm a guy who wrestled in high school and served my country, and now I serve my community. What I am is a guy who knows that I'm going to help someone in trouble. You know, that's the bottom line.
Daniel has to protect and serve. It is what he's done from the very beginning as a Marine. It's what he does every day as a firefighter. So this is ingrained in his character. It's hard to separate that, even if your life is on the line.
And now, Daniel's only hope is that his story can give a positive message to others.
Hopefully it inspired some people to pay more attention to help each other out. The tenacity of a good citizen and good Samaritan is undeniable.
Daytona Beach is known to millions of visitors for its endless shoreline, roaring motorcycle rallies, and bright Florida sunshine. Every year, tourists arrive expecting warm ocean breezes, crowded boardwalks, and the promise of escape from ordinary life. It is the kind of place that seems built for postcards, where the sound of crashing waves often drowns out everything else. But every city has two faces. One belongs to the people who come for a weekend. The other belongs to those who never leave. Beneath the image of beaches and vacation resorts existed another Daytona Beach, one that rarely appeared in travel brochures. It was a place where some people lived on society's margins, where addiction, homelessness, and survival shaped everyday existence, and where disappearing could happen without immediately causing alarm. Between late 2005 and early 2006, several women vanished from this quieter, overlooked world. Their disappearances did not dominate national headlines. Television crews did not rush to the city. For a time, there was no widespread panic, no public warning that a serial killer might be stalking vulnerable women. Instead, each disappearance appeared to stand alone, separated by circumstance, location, and the complicated lives of the victims themselves. Looking back today, knowing what investigators would eventually uncover, it is tempting to imagine obvious warning signs. But history rarely feels obvious while it's unfolding. Investigators faced scattered crime scenes, limited evidence, and victims whose disappearances were not always reported immediately. There were no dramatic confessions, no eyewitnesses who could point directly toward a suspect, and no single clue that suddenly united every piece of the puzzle. Instead, there were fragments that would remain disconnected for years. This is the story of the man eventually identified as the Daytona Beach serial killer, Robert Tyrone Hayes. It is also the story of the women whose lives ended long before justice finally caught up with the person responsible. Before continuing, one important clarification must be made. Some articles, online discussions, and true crime communities have referred to this case using the phrase "monster of Florence copycat." That description is not an official investigative title. Law enforcement authorities have never concluded that Robert Tyrone Hayes copied or was inspired by the infamous monster of Florence murders in Italy. The comparison exists largely because some observers noticed a loose similarity in the general hunting pattern. The monster of Florence targeted couples in isolated places, while Hayes targeted women who were alone and vulnerable before taking them to secluded locations. Beyond that broad comparison, investigators have never established any factual connection between the two cases. Throughout this story, the offender will therefore be identified by the name recognized in official reporting: the Daytona Beach serial killer, Robert Tyrone Hayes. Accuracy matters, especially in stories involving real victims whose lives deserve to be remembered without exaggeration or myth. One question sits quietly at the center of this case. How can someone kill multiple people and remain unidentified for nearly 14 years? The answer is not simple. It cannot be reduced to one investigative mistake or one lucky escape. Instead, it is found in a combination of circumstances that gradually allowed a dangerous offender to disappear into the background. The women who became victims shared one heartbreaking characteristic. They belonged to groups that society often overlooks. Many lived difficult lives shaped by homelessness, drug addiction, or sex work. Their disappearances were not always reported immediately because, in many cases, family relationships had fractured or regular contact had already become uncommon. When someone is expected to come home every evening, even a few missed hours can trigger concern. But when someone's life is already unstable, absence can remain unnoticed for days or even longer. This painful reality would become one of the greatest obstacles facing investigators. The first homicide did not automatically suggest the existence of a serial killer. The second still allowed room for coincidence. Only after additional similarities began to emerge did investigators start asking whether the same individual might be responsible. By then, valuable time had already passed. At the beginning, police had little reason to assume that the cases formed a larger pattern. The victims were discovered in different locations. There were no eyewitnesses capable of identifying a suspect. There was no obvious vehicle description that could be followed from one investigation to another. Each case demanded attention on its own, but nothing immediately connected them into one horrifying narrative. It is easy, years later, to connect those points in a straight line. It was far more difficult for detectives standing inside those investigations with incomplete information. One of the most challenging aspects of serial homicide investigations is that patterns are often visible only in hindsight. Detectives cannot compare today's evidence against tomorrow's crime. Every investigation begins with uncertainty. And certainty usually arrives only after enough tragedies have already occurred. That painful truth would define the early months of the Daytona Beach investigation. As investigators searched for answers, the offender remained unknown. There was no public face attached to the crimes. No recognizable nickname dominated newspaper headlines at the time. Robert Tyrone Hayes continued living his life without attracting the attention that would eventually expose him. According to later investigations, Hayes worked as a truck driver, a profession involving frequent travel between cities. That mobility would later become one factor complicating efforts to identify him. But during the earliest stages of the investigation, detectives did not even know they were looking for a truck driver. They were searching for someone whose identity, occupation, and movements remained completely hidden. The murders themselves offered few immediate answers. Investigators would later establish important similarities, but at first, evidence remained frustratingly limited. The lack of witnesses meant detectives could not build a suspect sketch from public observations. There were no reliable reports describing a vehicle, no detailed accounts of conversations between victims and an unknown man, and no immediate breakthrough capable of transforming the investigation overnight. Cases like these often create an unsettling silence. Families wait for answers. Detectives pursue every available lead. Communities continue with daily life, unaware that an offender may still be present among them. Meanwhile, the passage of time begins working against everyone except the person responsible. Memories fade. Physical evidence deteriorates. Potential witnesses relocate or forget seemingly insignificant details. Yet sometimes, time also becomes an unexpected ally for justice. In 2005 and early 2006, investigators could preserve evidence even when they lacked the technology necessary to fully interpret it. Biological material collected from crime scenes could be stored carefully, waiting for future advances in forensic science. At the time, no one could predict exactly when or how those scientific developments might arrive. The evidence itself remained silent, locked away inside laboratory storage, waiting for a future investigation that did not yet exist. That quiet preservation would eventually become one of the most important decisions in the entire case. It serves as a reminder that successful criminal investigations are not always solved through dramatic interrogations or sudden confessions. Sometimes the most valuable evidence simply waits patiently until science catches up with the questions investigators have been asking for years. Long before Robert Tyrone Hayes' name became known to the public, long before DNA comparisons finally connected separate investigations, and long before 3 life sentences would be imposed, there were only unanswered disappearances and grieving families searching for explanations. The women at the heart of this case were more than statistics in a homicide file. They were individuals whose lives, despite hardship, carried value that deserved recognition. Their stories did not become important because they were murdered. They were important long before that. Yet for years, their deaths remained unresolved, their killer unidentified, and their families left without the certainty that justice would ever arrive. The investigation that eventually solved these crimes would stretch across nearly a decade and a half, crossing city boundaries and relying on forensic technology that had not yet provided the answers detectives needed when the murders first occurred. It would become a reminder that justice can move slowly, sometimes painfully so, but that evidence preserved with care can continue speaking long after those responsible believe they have escaped accountability. In the chapters ahead, we begin not with the killer, but with the victims and the city where their lives intersected with one of Florida's most significant serial murder investigations. To understand why the Daytona Beach murders remained unsolved for so long, it is necessary to first understand the environment in which they occurred. Daytona Beach, located along Florida's Atlantic coast, was widely recognized as a destination for tourists seeking warm weather, motorsports, and oceanfront entertainment. For visitors, the city represented leisure and escape. Hotels overlooked the shoreline, restaurants welcomed travelers throughout the year, and thousands of people arrived expecting little more than sunshine and relaxation. Yet every city contains realities that exist beyond the places most visitors see. Away from the beachfront attractions were neighborhoods where economic hardship, addiction, homelessness, and instability shaped daily life. Among those living in these circumstances were women whose lives were often marked by vulnerability. Some struggled with substance abuse. Some experienced homelessness. Some engaged in sex work to survive. These circumstances did not define their humanity, but they did influence how quickly their disappearances were recognized and investigated. When someone lives without stable housing or regular contact with family members, days may pass before anyone realizes they are missing. When someone is already moving between temporary locations, absence may not immediately seem unusual. This painful reality would become one of the greatest advantages for the person responsible for the murders. Investigators later recognized that the victims shared characteristics that made them especially vulnerable. At the time, however, each disappearance initially appeared isolated. There was no immediate evidence proving that a single offender was targeting women from the same population. Detectives were forced to evaluate each homicide independently, examining the available physical evidence while attempting to reconstruct the final known movements of each victim. The first confirmed victim was Laketta Gunther, a 45-year-old woman whose disappearance in December 2005 marked the beginning of what investigators would later recognize as a series of connected murders. Publicly available information about Laketta's personal life is limited, and it is important not to invent details that have never been established. What is known is that she belonged to the vulnerable population investigators later identified as being at increased risk. She disappeared during December 2005, and for a short period, there were no clear answers regarding her whereabouts. Then came the discovery that transformed a missing person case into a homicide investigation. A few days after her disappearance, Laketta Gunther's body was found in a wooded area near a roadway. The location immediately suggested that whoever had left her there had chosen a place removed from public attention. The body had not been abandoned where large numbers of people would quickly discover it. Instead, it had been left in an area where detection might reasonably be delayed. Medical examination determined that Laketta had died from strangulation. Investigators also observed something equally significant. There was no indication that robbery had been the motive. Her death did not resemble a crime committed solely for financial gain. That observation immediately narrowed certain investigative possibilities while leaving many others unanswered. Without witnesses and with limited physical evidence pointing toward a specific suspect, detectives faced a difficult challenge. Every homicide investigation begins with fundamental questions. Who last saw the victim alive? Where had she been before disappearing? Did anyone report suspicious activity nearby? Was there any forensic evidence capable of identifying the offender? In Laketta Gunther's case, those questions proved extraordinarily difficult to answer. Investigators searched for connections, interviewed individuals who might have encountered her, and examined the circumstances surrounding the discovery of her body. Yet no immediate breakthrough emerged. There was no suspect waiting to be questioned. No eyewitness stepped forward with a detailed description. No obvious trail led detectives toward a particular individual. Cases involving vulnerable victims often present exactly these difficulties. When daily routines are irregular, establishing an accurate timeline becomes significantly more complicated. Determining precisely where someone was last seen, whom they encountered, or what happened during their final hours may involve incomplete or inconsistent information. These challenges are not unique to this investigation, but they illustrate why solving crimes against marginalized victims can require extraordinary persistence. At this stage, investigators had no confirmed reason to believe Laketta's murder formed part of a broader pattern. Homicide detectives routinely evaluate whether a killing appears random, personal, financially motivated, or connected to other crimes. In December 2005, there was insufficient evidence to confidently place Laketta's murder into any larger category. It remained a tragic but seemingly isolated homicide awaiting further leads. Yet while investigators continued searching for answers, the individual responsible remained free. There is a tendency in hindsight to assume that serial offenders are immediately recognizable, because audiences already know the ending of the story. Reality is far less straightforward. A serial murder investigation usually develops one case at a time, each requiring independent analysis before similarities become impossible to ignore. During those early weeks following Laketta's death, detectives could not yet know whether they were investigating one murder or the beginning of several. The uncertainty affected every decision they made. Every piece of evidence had to be preserved carefully because investigators could not predict what future significance it might hold. Biological samples, forensic material, and documentation collected during the investigation would later become critically important, even though they did not immediately reveal the offender's identity. Preservation often receives little public attention, yet it represents one of the most essential responsibilities in homicide investigations. Evidence that cannot solve a crime today may become decisive years later as scientific methods improve. In this case, that principle would eventually prove true. Meanwhile, the community itself had little reason to believe a serial predator might be operating nearby. Individual homicides, while tragic, do not automatically indicate a pattern. Without clear similarities recognized across investigations, public awareness remains limited. For the families of victims, however, the absence of immediate answers created its own form of suffering. Every day, without an arrest, extended uncertainty. Every unanswered question reinforced the painful reality that someone had taken a life and remained unidentified. Law enforcement officers carried the burden of that uncertainty as well. Detectives assigned to homicide cases understand that time influences investigations in complicated ways. Some evidence becomes more difficult to recover as weeks and months pass. Witness memories become less reliable. Potential leads disappear. At the same time, investigators cannot simply manufacture evidence where none exists. They must work within the limits of facts, forensic science, and legally admissible proof. In Laketa Gunther's case, those limits prevented a quick resolution. Still, the investigation continued. Officers documented every available detail, preserving information that might someday connect with evidence from another crime. At the time, no one could know that another woman would soon disappear under circumstances that would gradually reshape investigators' understanding of what they were confronting. The significance of Laketa Gunther's case would not become fully apparent until later, when detectives began comparing similarities between multiple victims. Only then would investigators start asking whether the same unknown offender had struck again. For now, however, there was only one confirmed homicide, one grieving family seeking justice, and one investigation searching for answers that remained frustratingly out of reach. Looking back today, Laketa Gunther's murder stands not only as the first confirmed killing attributed to Robert Tyrone Hayes, but also as the moment when a pattern quietly began without anyone fully recognizing it. The evidence collected during those earliest days did not immediately identify a suspect, but it was preserved with care. Years later, advances in forensic DNA analysis would give new meaning to evidence that had once seemed incapable of solving the crime. Until then, however, the investigation remained suspended between hope and uncertainty, while the person responsible continued to move freely, unknown to the public and beyond the reach of justice. The murder of Laketa Gunther left investigators with more questions than answers. They knew how she had died. They knew where her body had been found. They also knew that robbery did not appear to be the motive. Beyond those facts, however, the investigation had very little to build upon. There were no reliable eyewitnesses capable of identifying the person responsible. No obvious suspect whose connection to the victim could immediately explain the crime, and no breakthrough capable of moving the case rapidly toward an arrest. Like countless homicide investigations across the country, the file remained active, but progress came slowly. Detectives continued gathering information while hoping that a new witness, a forensic development, or an unexpected lead might eventually change the direction of the investigation. Unfortunately, before those answers arrived, another woman disappeared. Around 1 month after Laketa Gunther's murder, Julie Green vanished. At first, her disappearance did not automatically confirm that investigators were dealing with a serial offender. Missing person cases arise under many different circumstances, and detectives must resist drawing conclusions before evidence supports them. Nevertheless, as investigators began assembling the available facts, certain details attracted attention. According to the information later documented, during the investigation. Julie Green was last seen getting into a vehicle driven by a black man. That sighting would become one of the final known observations of her alive. Beyond that limited account, however, investigators possessed little information about where the vehicle went or who the driver actually was. No reliable license plate number was recorded. No witness could identify the driver by name. No additional description emerged that could immediately direct detectives toward a specific individual. The sighting provided investigators with a direction to consider, but not enough evidence to identify a suspect. As in the earlier investigation, uncertainty continued to dominate every stage of the case. After Julie disappeared, the search ended in another devastating discovery. Her body was eventually found in a wooded area. Once again, investigators were confronted with a scene bearing disturbing similarities to the earlier homicide. Medical examination determined that Julie Green had also been strangled. Like Laketta Gunther, she had been left outdoors after her death, abandoned in a secluded location rather than somewhere likely to produce an immediate discovery. These similarities could not simply be ignored. Detectives routinely compare homicides for recurring characteristics. Similar methods of killing, comparable victim profiles, and comparable body disposal locations may indicate that separate investigations are connected. Still, investigators must distinguish between meaningful patterns and coincidence. Two murders sharing certain characteristics do not automatically prove the involvement of one offender. Detectives therefore approached the comparison carefully, examining what could be established through evidence rather than assumption. The similarities gradually became difficult to dismiss. Both women belonged to vulnerable populations. Both had disappeared before their bodies were located. Both died by strangulation. Both were abandoned outdoors in relatively isolated areas. Neither investigation immediately produced witnesses capable of identifying the offender. At the same time, important questions remained unanswered. Were the victims connected to one another? Had they known the same individuals? Had they frequented similar locations before disappearing? Without definitive answers, investigators could only continue comparing available evidence while remaining cautious about declaring the existence of a serial killer. Public understanding of serial murder investigations is often influenced by television dramas, where detectives recognize patterns almost immediately and suspects emerge within days. Reality is rarely so straightforward. Detectives cannot simply assume that similar crimes were committed by the same person. Such assumptions risk overlooking alternative explanations and may compromise an investigation if unsupported by evidence. Instead, investigators proceed methodically, evaluating similarities while continuing to treat each case independently until stronger connections emerge. That careful approach was necessary in Daytona Beach as well. As investigators worked through Julie Green's homicide, they still lacked the decisive evidence needed to identify whoever had killed both women, if indeed the same person was responsible. Time continued to pass, and with every passing week, the possibility increased that the offender remained free to strike again. Tragically, that fear would soon become reality. In February 2006, another woman disappeared. Her name was Iwana Patton. Once again, investigators found themselves confronting a case involving a vulnerable woman whose life ended under circumstances that appeared alarmingly familiar. Her body was later discovered near a highway. The location differed somewhat from the previous recovery sites. Yet investigators immediately recognized important similarities in the overall sequence of events. According to the information established during the investigation, the offender appeared to approach the victim, bring her into a vehicle, strangle her, and abandon her body in a secluded area. The recurring pattern now extended across 3 confirmed victims. While each homicide contained its own unique investigative details, the broader similarities became increasingly significant. Detectives compared timelines, forensic findings, victim backgrounds, and body recovery locations. Although evidence remained limited, the emerging picture suggested that these crimes might not be isolated after all. 3 women had disappeared within a relatively short period. 3 women belonged to similarly vulnerable populations. 3 women had died by strangulation. 3 bodies had been abandoned outdoors after death. Individually, any one of these similarities might have been explained through coincidence. Together, they presented a pattern investigators could no longer ignore. This realization represented a turning point, not because detectives suddenly knew who the killer was, but because they increasingly believed they were searching for a single offender rather than investigating unrelated homicides. Recognizing a pattern changes an investigation in important ways. Information from one case can now be compared directly with evidence collected from another. Detectives begin searching for recurring behaviors rather than isolated incidents. Every witness statement is reconsidered. Every forensic sample is evaluated not only within its own investigation, but also alongside evidence recovered elsewhere. Even seemingly insignificant details may become meaningful when examined across multiple crime scenes. Yet recognizing a pattern does not automatically solve it. In fact, serial investigations often become more complicated precisely because they involve multiple victims, multiple locations, and larger volumes of evidence. Detectives now face the possibility that someone was deliberately targeting women who lived on society's margins. At the same time, they still lack the information necessary to identify that individual. No reliable witness could place the same suspect with all 3 victims. No vehicle description connected every case. No public tip immediately pointed toward Robert Tyrone Hayes or anyone else. The investigation remained defined by absence of witnesses, absence of clear suspects, and absence of direct evidence identifying the killer. One painful truth also became increasingly difficult to ignore. The victim's shared vulnerability may have influenced not only the offender's choices, but also the practical difficulties of the investigation itself. Women experiencing homelessness, addiction, or involvement in sex work often move through environments where interactions are less likely to be carefully documented. Regular routines may vary from day to day. Family contact may be inconsistent. Potential witnesses may themselves struggle with unstable living conditions or incomplete recollections. None of these circumstances diminish the value of the victims' lives. Instead, they illustrate the profound challenges investigators encounter when crimes target individuals whose disappearances may not immediately attract widespread attention. As detectives reviewed the growing collection of evidence, another realization slowly emerged. If one offender was responsible for all 3 murders, then he had demonstrated a repeated ability to approach vulnerable women, gain sufficient access to isolate them, kill them by strangulation, and dispose of their bodies without leaving investigators with enough information to identify him. Such consistency suggested planning, confidence, and an awareness of how to avoid immediate detection. Still, investigators could not substitute inference for proof. Their responsibility remained the same as it had been after the first homicide: gather evidence, preserve every available forensic sample, and continue searching for facts capable of identifying the unknown offender. The identity of Robert Tyrone Hayes would remain hidden for many more years. At this point in the story, detectives did not know his name, his occupation, or the role that future advances in DNA analysis would eventually play. They knew only that 3 women were dead, that the similarities between their cases demanded serious attention, and that somewhere beyond the evidence already collected, the person responsible remained free. The investigation had reached a critical crossroads. What had begun as separate homicide investigations was evolving into the search for a serial killer. But recognizing that possibility was only the beginning. The far more difficult task, finding the individual responsible, still lay years in the future. And the obstacles standing between investigators and the truth were only beginning to reveal themselves. By the time investigators had begun comparing the deaths of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton, one conclusion was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Whether or not they could yet prove it beyond doubt. The similarities between the three murders suggested that they were no longer dealing with isolated acts of violence. Three women from similarly vulnerable circumstances had disappeared within a relatively short period of time. All three were later found dead after being strangled. And all three had been left in secluded outdoor locations. The emerging pattern demanded attention. Yet recognizing a possible serial offender was only the first step. Identifying that offender would prove to be far more difficult. The investigation entered a stage familiar to many long unsolved homicide cases. Detectives understood the nature of the problem they were facing, but they lacked the evidence necessary to solve it. Every day that passed without an arrest created another opportunity for the unknown killer to remain hidden. Every unanswered question added another layer of frustration for investigators and another measure of grief for the families still waiting for justice. One of the greatest obstacles confronting law enforcement was the background shared by the victims themselves. Investigators later noted that the women belonged to populations widely recognized as being at elevated risk. Some were involved in sex work. Some struggled with drug addiction. Some experienced homelessness or unstable living conditions. These facts are not judgments about the victims. They are essential to understanding why the investigation unfolded as it did. People living under such circumstances often move between different locations, maintain irregular schedules, and may lose regular contact with relatives or friends. As a result, their disappearances are sometimes not recognized immediately. In many missing person investigations, the earliest hours are critical. Family members report that a loved one failed to return home. Employers notice an unexplained absence. Friends become concerned after repeated unanswered calls. These early warnings help investigators establish timelines and preserve fresh evidence. In contrast, when someone lives without a fixed residence or consistent daily routine, determining exactly when they disappeared becomes much more difficult. The delay is not caused by indifference from those who care about them. Rather, it reflects the instability that often accompanies life on society's margins. That instability can unintentionally provide an offender with valuable time before anyone realizes that a crime has occurred. Detectives understood this painful reality. They also recognized that it may have influenced the offender's choice of victims. Although Robert Tyrone Hayes never offered a complete explanation for his crimes, investigators later believed that selecting vulnerable women reduced the likelihood of immediate detection. From a purely investigative perspective, such victims often leave behind fewer immediate leads, fewer witnesses, and longer periods before their absence triggers widespread concern. It is a harsh observation, but one supported by the practical challenges detectives encountered throughout the case. Another major obstacle was the near total absence of eyewitnesses capable of identifying the killer. Investigations frequently succeed because ordinary people notice extraordinary details. A passerby remembers a suspicious vehicle. A store employee recalls an unusual conversation. A neighbor reports unfamiliar activity. In the Daytona Beach murders, however, those kinds of observations were largely unavailable. The final known sighting connected to Julie Green established only that she had entered a vehicle, driven by a black man. Beyond that limited information, investigators had almost nothing concrete to pursue. No witness recorded a license plate. No detailed physical description of the driver emerged. No surveillance footage captured the encounter. The observation confirmed that Julie had entered a vehicle, but it did not identify the individual behind the wheel. Without additional evidence, detectives could not transform that single observation into an arrest. Similar difficulties surrounded the other investigations. There was no reliable description consistently placing the same suspect near every victim. No member of the public came forward claiming to recognize a man repeatedly approaching vulnerable women. Even if someone had seen the offender briefly, it is entirely possible they would have considered the encounter unremarkable. Everyday interactions occur constantly, especially in busy urban environments, unless something immediately appears suspicious. Most people have little reason to remember a stranger they passed for only a few seconds. Consequently, investigators found themselves attempting to identify an unknown offender with almost no reliable witness testimony to guide them. Physical evidence offered some hope, but not enough to solve the case immediately. Detectives carefully preserved forensic material recovered during the investigations, understanding that even evidence without immediate value could become important later. Experienced investigators know that preserving evidence is an investment in the future. Scientific techniques continue to evolve, and material that cannot answer today's questions may become decisive years later. During the mid-2000s, however, investigators still lacked the crucial connection that would eventually identify Robert Tyrone Hayes. The evidence existed, but the technology and circumstances necessary to interpret it fully had not yet aligned. While detectives struggled with limited leads, the person responsible continued moving through daily life unnoticed. Investigators would later determine that Robert Tyrone Hayes worked as a truck driver. This detail became significant because truck driving naturally involves frequent travel between cities and regions. Individuals employed in long-distance transportation may spend substantial periods away from one location, making it more difficult for investigators to recognize patterns tied to residency or routine. It is important not to exaggerate the significance of Hayes' occupation. Truck driving itself is an entirely legitimate profession performed by countless law-abiding individuals every day. In this investigation, however, detectives later recognized that Hayes' mobility may have complicated efforts to identify him during the period when the murders occurred. At the time, investigators did not know they were searching for a truck driver. They had no reason to focus on transportation workers specifically. Only after Hayes was eventually identified years later did his occupation become part of the broader understanding of how he had avoided detection for so long. The combination of victim vulnerability, limited witnesses, preserved but inconclusive forensic evidence, and the offender's mobility created an exceptionally difficult investigative environment. Each factor alone presents challenges. Together, they produced a case capable of remaining unsolved for more than a decade. Despite these obstacles, investigators did not abandon the search. Detectives continued reviewing evidence, comparing similarities between cases, and preserving every piece of forensic material that might someday prove useful. Cold cases are often misunderstood by the public. The phrase can suggest that an investigation has ended, when in reality, many cold cases remain active in important ways. Evidence is stored. Files are reviewed. New technologies are evaluated. Detectives revisit earlier conclusions whenever additional information becomes available. Although progress may appear invisible from the outside, important work often continues quietly behind the scenes. The Daytona Beach investigation would eventually benefit from exactly that kind of persistence. During the years immediately following the murders, however, there was no dramatic breakthrough. The offender remained unidentified. The victims' families continued living with unanswered questions. Investigators faced the difficult responsibility of explaining that despite extensive efforts, No arrest had yet been made. Every unsolved homicide carries emotional consequences extending far beyond the crime itself. Families are denied the certainty that often accompanies justice. Communities lose confidence when dangerous offenders remain unidentified. Detectives carry the professional burden of unfinished work, aware that somewhere a killer remains free. In cases involving serial offenders, that burden becomes even heavier because every unsolved murder raises the possibility of additional victims. By this stage of the investigation, detectives increasingly suspected that the 3 confirmed murders reflected the work of one individual. Yet suspicion alone could never replace proof. Courts require evidence. Arrests require evidence. Convictions require evidence. Detectives, therefore, continued doing what successful investigators have always done, preserving facts rather than assumptions, protecting evidence rather than speculation, and waiting for the moment when science or circumstance might finally reveal the identity hidden behind years of unanswered questions. Unknown to everyone involved, that moment would not arrive quickly. Nearly a decade would pass before another investigation, another victim, and advances in forensic DNA analysis would begin connecting pieces of evidence that had remained separated for years. The invisible killer who had eluded detection throughout the Daytona Beach murders had not disappeared forever. He had simply remained beyond the reach of the technology available at the time. Eventually, that would change, and when it did, one preserved strand of biological evidence would accomplish what years of traditional investigation alone could not. It would finally give a name to the man detectives had been searching for all along. When investigators first began examining the similarities between the murders of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton, there was hope that recognizing a possible pattern would eventually lead to the person responsible. In many criminal investigations, identifying a pattern marks the beginning of rapid progress. Detectives compare evidence, search for recurring behaviors, and narrow the list of potential suspects until the investigation reaches a breakthrough. But not every case follows that path. Some investigations move forward only a few steps before encountering a wall that seems impossible to overcome. The Daytona Beach murders became one of those cases. As months gradually turned into years, the investigation remained active in principle. Yet no decisive evidence emerged that could identify the unknown offender. The murders had not been forgotten, but neither had they been solved. The questions remained exactly where investigators had left them. Who had approached these women? How had he persuaded or managed to isolate them? Where had he gone after abandoning their bodies? Most importantly, who was he? Those questions lingered without answers. For the families of the victims, the passage of time carried its own unique burden. Every anniversary arrived with the same uncertainty that had existed the year before. Every holiday served as another reminder of an empty place that could never again be filled. Unlike cases that quickly result in arrests, unsolved homicides deny families a clear ending. There is no courtroom verdict to provide a measure of closure, no confession explaining why the crime occurred, and no certainty that justice will ever arrive. Instead, there is only waiting, waiting for investigators to call, waiting for new evidence to appear, waiting for hope that often fades as the years continue passing. Detectives experience a different form of waiting. Their work rarely ends simply because an investigation grows older. Case files remain preserved. Evidence remains cataloged. Notes from interviews, forensic reports, photographs, and laboratory results continue to exist long after public attention has shifted elsewhere. The term cold case often suggests inactivity. But in reality, many cold cases remain carefully maintained because investigators understand something the public sometimes overlooks. Evidence does not lose its value simply because time has passed. In fact, some forms of evidence become even more valuable as forensic science continues to evolve. This principle would eventually prove decisive in the Daytona Beach investigation. During the years following the murders, detectives continued preserving biological evidence collected from the crime scenes. At the time those samples were gathered, they could not provide investigators with the identity of the killer. They represented possibilities rather than answers. Yet preserving them required patience and discipline because no one could predict what future scientific developments might accomplish. Homicide investigations are built upon an important understanding. Evidence collected today may answer questions that cannot yet be solved, rather than discarding or overlooking material that appeared inconclusive. Investigators maintain it carefully. That decision reflected both professional experience and respect for the victims whose cases remained unresolved. Every preserved sample represented another opportunity for justice, even if that opportunity would not become clear for many years. As the investigation entered its second, third, and eventually fourth year without an arrest, the unknown offender remained exactly that, unknown. Robert Tyrone Hayes was not yet a suspect. His name appeared nowhere in connection with the Daytona Beach murders. Investigators did not know they were searching for a truck driver. They did not know where the future breakthrough would originate. The case existed in a frustrating state familiar to many long-term homicide investigations. Detectives believed they possessed evidence that mattered, yet lacked the ability to connect it to the individual responsible. During these years, investigators also had to confront another difficult reality. The 3 confirmed murders represented only those cases that could be directly examined using the available evidence. Law enforcement remained aware that other unsolved crimes might exist, but awareness alone could never justify criminal charges. Investigators must distinguish carefully between suspicion and proof. Although Robert Tyrone Hayes would later become a suspect in additional killings, including the 2008 death of Stacey Gage, evidence sufficient to support prosecution did not exist for every case. This distinction is fundamental to the criminal justice system. Detectives may reasonably explore possible connections between unsolved homicides, but prosecutors require evidence capable of meeting the legal standard necessary for conviction. Maintaining that distinction protects both the integrity of investigations and the fairness of criminal proceedings. Throughout these years, advances in forensic science continued transforming criminal investigations across the United States. DNA analysis became increasingly sophisticated, allowing laboratories to recover information from biological material that earlier generations of investigators could not fully interpret. Improvements in technology expanded the possibilities available to detectives working long unsolved cases. Evidence that once seemed incapable of identifying an offender gradually acquired new significance. As scientific methods improved, none of these developments guaranteed success. Technology alone cannot solve crimes without evidence to examine. Fortunately, in the Daytona Beach investigation, investigators had preserved exactly the type of biological material that future forensic analysis would require. At the time those decisions were made, no one knew precisely how important they would become. Yet the careful preservation of evidence ensured that the investigation remained capable of benefiting from every advancement that followed. While science continued progressing, the lives of the victims remained central to the purpose of the investigation. It is easy in discussions of forensic breakthroughs to focus primarily on technology, laboratory techniques, and investigative strategy. But every scientific development mattered for one reason above all others. It offered another chance to identify the person responsible for taking 3 human lives. Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton had each entered the criminal justice system not by choice, but because they had become victims of homicide. The passage of years did not reduce the significance of their lives or the responsibility investigators felt toward their cases. Although the public heard relatively little about the investigation during this period, work continued quietly behind the scenes. Detectives periodically revisited the files, reviewed evidence, and remained prepared for any new development capable of changing the course of the investigation. This patience reflects one of the defining characteristics of successful homicide investigations. Some cases are solved in days. Others require decades. Investigators cannot control when evidence will finally reveal the truth. They can only ensure that when the opportunity arrives, the case remains prepared to move forward. As nearly a decade passed after the Daytona Beach murders, the unknown offender had every reason to believe he had escaped accountability. Years had gone by without arrest. Public attention had diminished. The investigation remained unsolved despite extensive efforts. From the outside, it may have appeared that the opportunity for justice had disappeared forever. Yet hidden inside evidence storage facilities and forensic laboratories, the foundation of the future breakthrough already existed. Biological evidence collected years earlier remained preserved exactly as investigators had intended. It waited silently, carrying information no one had yet been able to unlock. Justice in this case would not arrive because a witness suddenly remembered a forgotten detail or because an offender confessed to crimes committed years before. Instead, the breakthrough would emerge from the convergence of two developments occurring independently of one another. Continued advances in DNA technology and an entirely separate homicide investigation that initially seemed unrelated to the Daytona Beach murders. Neither investigators nor the victims' families could have predicted that the key to solving crimes committed in 2005 and 2006 would begin to appear only after another murder occurred years later in a different part of Florida. Yet, that is often the unpredictable nature of long-term criminal investigations. Cases that appear disconnected may eventually intersect through forensic evidence rather than eyewitness testimony. The truth may remain hidden not because it no longer exists, but because science has not yet reached the point where it can reveal it. By the end of this long period of silence, investigators still lack the name they had been seeking for years. But the investigation had not failed. It had simply reached the limits of what contemporary evidence and technology could accomplish. Beyond those limits, unseen by everyone involved, the final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to move into place. The breakthrough that had seemed impossible for nearly 14 years was now approaching, not through luck, speculation, or coincidence, but through the quiet persistence of preserved evidence and the steady advancement of forensic science that would soon give a voice to clues that had remained silent for far too long. For nearly 14 years, the Daytona Beach murders existed in a state familiar to many cold cases. The evidence had been preserved, the investigations had never truly been abandoned, and detectives remained committed to finding answers whenever new opportunities emerged. Yet despite those efforts, the identity of the person responsible remained unknown. The files documenting the deaths of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton continued to wait inside evidence rooms and investigative archives, carrying questions that no one had yet been able to answer. Time had not erased the crimes, but had placed them into a long period of uncertainty. Then, in 2016, events unfolded elsewhere in Florida that would eventually change everything. The breakthrough did not begin in Daytona Beach. It began in Palm Beach, a different part of the state, during the investigation of another homicide. In that case, a woman named Rachel Bay was murdered. Like every homicide investigation, detectives worked to secure the crime scene, document evidence, and recover anything that might identify the person responsible. Among the evidence collected was biological material capable of producing a DNA profile. At that moment, Investigators focused on solving the Palm Beach murder itself. There was no immediate indication that the evidence would eventually reopen one of Daytona Beach's longest unresolved serial murder investigations. Yet, that is one of the remarkable characteristics of forensic science. Biological evidence collected in one investigation may later reveal connections extending far beyond the original crime scene. Unlike eyewitness memories, which naturally fade over time, DNA remains constant. It does not become less accurate with the passing of years. It simply waits until investigators possess both the technology and the opportunity to compare it with other evidence. This principle would become the foundation of the breakthrough that followed. During the years separating the Daytona Beach murders from the Palm Beach investigation, forensic DNA analysis had continued advancing. Laboratories became increasingly capable of comparing biological evidence preserved from older investigations with profiles obtained from newer cases. Detectives responsible for unresolved homicides understood the importance of these developments because they offered something that had not existed when many cold cases were first investigated: the possibility that preserved evidence could finally reveal the identity of an unknown offender. The biological evidence recovered in the Palm Beach homicide was eventually compared with forensic material preserved from the unsolved Daytona Beach murders. That comparison produced the result investigators had been waiting years to see. The DNA matched. For the first time since the murders of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton, detectives possessed scientific evidence connecting an individual to crimes that had remained unsolved for well over a decade. That individual was Robert Tyrone Hayes. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. For years, investigators had worked without knowing who they were searching for. They had compared crime scenes, analyzed victimology, preserved forensic evidence, and considered numerous investigative possibilities. Yet none of those efforts had produced a suspect whose identity could be confirmed through objective scientific evidence. The DNA comparison changed that completely. Instead of pursuing an unknown offender, investigators now had a specific individual whose biological profile matched evidence preserved from the Daytona Beach murders. Unlike speculation or circumstantial assumptions, DNA provided investigators with a direct forensic connection. This breakthrough represented the point at which years of careful evidence preservation justified. The patience that detectives had demonstrated throughout the investigation. Had the original forensic material not been collected properly, documented carefully, and preserved for future analysis, the opportunity created by advances in DNA technology might never have existed. Every investigator involved in the early stages of the Daytona Beach cases had contributed to this moment, even though they could not have predicted exactly when it would arrive. The breakthrough also illustrates one of the most important realities of modern homicide investigations. Solving a case is not always about discovering entirely new evidence. Sometimes the critical evidence has existed from the beginning. What changes is investigators' ability to interpret it. In the Daytona Beach investigation, the biological evidence recovered years earlier did not suddenly appear in 2016. It had been present all along. What transformed the investigation was the ability to compare that evidence successfully with DNA obtained during another homicide investigation. Once Robert Tyrone Hayes became linked through DNA, detectives could begin re-examining the Daytona Beach murders from an entirely different perspective. Instead of asking who might have committed the crimes, they could now ask how the available evidence fit together around a known individual. Every preserved forensic sample acquired renewed significance. Every investigative note could now be reviewed with Hayes identified as the person connected through biological evidence. It is important, however, to understand the sequence carefully. Hayes was not identified because investigators guessed correctly after years of searching. He was identified because objective forensic evidence established the connection. This distinction reflects one of the defining strengths of DNA evidence within the criminal justice system. Scientific analysis does not depend upon memory, opinion, or personal belief. It relies upon measurable biological characteristics that remain consistent regardless of how much time has passed. The breakthrough also demonstrated the interconnected nature of modern criminal investigations. Although the Daytona Beach murders and the Palm Beach homicide occurred years apart and in different locations, forensic science created a bridge between them. Without the Palm Beach investigation, detectives might have continued waiting for another opportunity to identify the unknown offender. Without the preserved evidence from Daytona Beach, the Palm Beach DNA profile alone would not have solved the earlier murders. Both investigations became essential parts of the same larger story. For the families of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton, this development represented something they had been denied for years: meaningful progress. While no forensic discovery can erase the pain caused by homicide, identifying the person responsible transforms an investigation from uncertainty toward accountability. Questions that had remained unanswered for nearly 14 years finally began receiving factual, evidence-based responses. The unknown offender now had a name. The invisible figure who had remained beyond investigators' reach throughout the original investigation was no longer hidden. Robert Tyrone Hayes had become the central focus of the reopened investigation into the Daytona Beach murders. Yet even with this extraordinary breakthrough, investigators still had important work ahead. DNA established a powerful forensic connection, but detectives needed to review every aspect of the earlier investigations carefully. They would return to preserved evidence, compare biological material, evaluate forensic findings collected years earlier, and determine exactly how the available evidence supported criminal charges in each homicide. The investigation was entering a new phase, not one defined by uncertainty about the offender's identity, but by the careful reconstruction of crimes that had remained unsolved for almost 14 years. Every document collected during the original investigations suddenly became relevant once again. Every laboratory report acquired renewed importance. Every preserved sample could now be examined with a specific purpose, determining how Robert Tyrone Hayes could be linked to each individual victim through admissible forensic evidence. The years of waiting had finally produced the opportunity detectives had hoped would someday arrive. Justice had not come quickly, but it had not disappeared either. It had been delayed until science provided investigators with the means to uncover the truth hidden inside evidence preserved since 2005 and 2006. The next stage of the investigation would transform that scientific breakthrough into a criminal case, carefully connecting Robert Tyrone Hayes to the murders of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton through the evidence that had patiently waited for nearly 14 years to speak. The identification of Robert Tyrone Hayes through DNA did not mark the end of the investigation. In many ways, it marked the beginning of its most demanding phase. For nearly 14 years, detectives had worked without knowing the identity of the person responsible for the murders of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton. Now, for the first time, they had a specific individual connected to the case through forensic evidence. But identifying a suspect and proving multiple counts of murder in court are two very different challenges. Investigators understood that every conclusion would need to be supported by evidence capable of withstanding careful legal examination. A scientific breakthrough could point them in the right direction, but every charge still required meticulous preparation. The first step involved returning to the original case files. Detectives reopened records that had remained preserved since 2005 and 2006. reviewing reports created during the earliest stages of each investigation. Crime scene documentation, medical findings, witness statements, laboratory reports, and evidence inventories all became relevant once again. Nothing could be overlooked simply because years had passed. Every detail collected during the original investigations now had to be examined alongside the newly established DNA connection. This process reflected one of the defining characteristics of successful cold case investigations. Rather than replacing earlier investigative work, new forensic evidence often gives fresh meaning to information that had existed from the beginning. Detectives were no longer searching blindly for an unknown offender. Instead, they were evaluating how every preserved piece of evidence fit into a case centered on Robert Tyrone Hayes. The biological evidence became the foundation of that effort. Investigators compared DNA recovered from the Daytona Beach crime scenes with a profile linked to Hayes. The results established a forensic connection between Hayes and the murder of Laketta Gunther, providing investigators with objective scientific evidence supporting the conclusion that he had been involved in her death. For a case that had remained unresolved for almost 14 years, this represented a remarkable transformation. Evidence that had once been incapable of identifying an offender could now identify one with extraordinary precision. Detectives then continued reviewing the remaining homicide investigations. Biological evidence and other preserved forensic material were carefully re-examined in relation to Julie Green. As the investigation progressed, the evidence established a connection between Hayes and Julie's murder as well. Once again, the significance extended beyond a single laboratory result. Investigators were able to demonstrate that separate pieces of evidence collected years earlier pointed toward the same individual. The pattern that detectives had suspected in 2006 was now supported by modern forensic science. The third confirmed victim, Awana Patton, underwent the same careful review. Detectives compared preserved evidence, laboratory findings, and biological material against the forensic profile linked to Hayes. The result was consistent with the conclusions reached in the other investigations. The available evidence connected Robert Tyrone Hayes to Awana Patton's murder, completing the forensic reconstruction of the 3 confirmed Daytona Beach homicides. For investigators who had spent years preserving evidence without knowing whether it would ever produce answers, this represented the validation of countless hours of patient work. The scientific comparisons did not erase the years during which the cases remained unsolved, but they finally explained why preserving every available piece of evidence had been so important. Each carefully stored sample had become a voice from the past, capable of identifying the person responsible long after the crimes themselves had occurred. One important principle guided detectives throughout this stage of the investigation. They remained careful to distinguish between evidence that supported criminal charges and evidence that justified further inquiry. This distinction became particularly important when investigators examined whether Hayes might have been responsible for additional killings beyond the 3 confirmed Daytona Beach murders. During the broader investigation, detectives considered the possibility that Hayes could be connected to the 2008 killing of Stacey Gage. Because homicide investigators routinely compare unsolved cases for possible similarities, examining additional cases was both appropriate and necessary. However, law enforcement also recognized the importance of maintaining strict evidentiary standards. Although Hayes became a suspect in Stacey Gage's homicide, investigators stated that they did not possess sufficient physical evidence to support criminal charges in that case. This distinction deserves careful attention because it reflects one of the core principles of the criminal justice system. Suspicion alone cannot justify prosecution. Investigators may reasonably believe that an individual deserves further scrutiny based on available information. But criminal charges require evidence capable of meeting legal standards in court. In the Daytona Beach investigation, detectives had such evidence for the murders of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton. They did not possess equivalent physical evidence regarding Stacy Gage's death. As a result, that case remained separate from the confirmed Daytona Beach convictions. This careful approach strengthened the integrity of the overall investigation. Rather than attempting to attribute every unsolved homicide to a newly identified serial offender, investigators limited their criminal case to those murders supported by objective forensic evidence. Such restraint demonstrates the importance of evidence-based policing. High-profile investigations often generate speculation, but successful prosecutions depend upon facts that can be established rather than assumptions that cannot. As detectives reconstructed the timeline surrounding the confirmed murders, the broader pattern also became clearer. The victims had all belonged to vulnerable populations, and investigators believe that this vulnerability played an important role in the offender's ability to avoid detection for so many years. Women experiencing homelessness, addiction, or involvement in sex work frequently encounter social circumstances that complicate missing person investigations. Their disappearances may not be recognized immediately, and their daily routines can be more difficult to reconstruct than those of individuals living more stable lives. Investigators concluded that Hayes appeared to have selected women whose circumstances reduced the likelihood of immediate police attention. This assessment did not diminish the value of the victims' lives. Instead, it acknowledged a painful reality that detectives repeatedly confront in cases involving marginalized communities. Crimes against vulnerable individuals often require greater investigative effort because fewer witnesses, delayed reporting, and unstable circumstances leave investigators with fewer immediate leads. Another conclusion gradually emerged as investigators reviewed the available evidence. While Hayes never provided a complete explanation for his crimes, investigators did not believe that sexual motivation represented the primary driving force behind the confirmed murders. Based upon the evidence available to them, detectives instead concluded that Hayes appeared motivated largely by a desire to control his victims, with strangulation serving as the method through which that control was ultimately exercised. Because Hayes offered no comprehensive account of his actions, investigators appropriately described these conclusions as professional assessments rather than established fact. Distinguishing between evidence and interpretation remained essential throughout the case. By this point, nearly 14 years had passed since the first murder. During those years, families had waited without certainty. Detectives had preserved evidence despite repeated frustration, and the identity of the offender had remained hidden. Now the investigation had been transformed by forensic science into a case supported by biological evidence linking Robert Tyrone Hayes to 3 murders committed years earlier. The work accomplished during this phase demonstrated that justice sometimes depends less upon dramatic investigative breakthroughs than upon persistence. Detectives who originally processed the Daytona Beach crime scenes could not know that their careful evidence collection would eventually solve the case. Laboratory personnel who preserved biological material could not predict exactly when technological advances would reveal its significance. Every stage of the investigation contributed to the final result, even when immediate progress appeared impossible. By reconstructing the 3 murders through preserved forensic evidence, investigators laid the foundation for criminal prosecution. The unknown offender who had once seemed invisible had become an identifiable defendant supported by scientific evidence gathered across nearly 14 years of investigative work. The next chapter would shift from investigation to the courtroom, where that evidence would be examined under legal standards and ultimately determine Robert Tyrone Hayes' fate. After years of unanswered questions, preserved evidence, and painstaking forensic review. The investigation into the Daytona Beach murders entered its final and most public phase. What had begun as a series of seemingly unrelated homicides in late 2005 and early 2006 was now presented within the framework of a criminal prosecution centered on one individual, Robert Tyrone Hayes. For the families of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton, the courtroom represented something they had waited nearly 14 years to see. It was not an opportunity to erase loss, because no legal proceeding can restore a life that has been taken. Instead, it was an opportunity for the evidence gathered over many years to be examined openly and for the justice system to determine whether the person identified through forensic science could be held legally responsible for the murders. Unlike dramatic courtroom portrayals often seen in fiction, homicide trials are built upon careful presentation rather than sudden revelations. Every piece of evidence introduced must satisfy legal standards regarding reliability and relevance. Witnesses testify to what they personally observed or professionally analyzed. Scientific findings are explained methodically so that the court can evaluate both the evidence itself and the conclusions investigators have drawn from it. In the prosecution of Robert Tyrone Hayes, the cornerstone of the case was the forensic evidence that had transformed the investigation after years of uncertainty. DNA analysis provided investigators with the objective connection they had lacked during the original investigations, rather than relying primarily on eyewitness identification or confession. Prosecutors were able to present biological evidence linking Hayes to the confirmed Daytona Beach murders. This distinction is significant because DNA evidence occupies a unique position within modern criminal investigations. While witness testimony can sometimes be affected by the passage of time or limitations of human memory, biological evidence remains unchanged. Properly collected and preserved forensic material can continue to provide reliable information many years after a crime has occurred. In this case, the careful preservation of evidence from 2005 and 2006 allowed investigators to benefit from advances in forensic science that were not available when the murders first took place. Prosecutors also relied upon the broader investigative reconstruction that detectives had completed after Hayes was identified. The murders of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton were no longer viewed as isolated events. Instead, investigators demonstrated how preserved evidence connected Hayes to each of the three victims. The individual investigations, once separated by uncertainty and limited leads, now formed a coherent body of evidence supported by scientific analysis. Every stage of the investigation, from the original crime scene processing to the later DNA comparisons, contributed to the prosecution's presentation of the case. Throughout the legal proceedings, investigators remained careful to distinguish between conclusions supported by evidence and theories that could not be proven. One important example involved Hayes' possible connection to other unsolved crimes. Detectives had examined whether he might be linked to the 2008 killing of Stacey Gage, but they acknowledged that sufficient physical evidence did not exist to support criminal charges in that case. Consequently, the prosecution focused on the three murders for which forensic evidence established the strongest legal foundation. This restraint reflected an essential principle of the justice system. Criminal convictions must rest upon evidence that meets the required legal standard, not upon speculation or the possibility that an individual may have committed additional crimes. By limiting the prosecution to the murders supported by objective forensic evidence, investigators strengthened the credibility of the case presented in court. Another important aspect of the proceedings concerned motive. Public discussion of serial homicide often focuses heavily on understanding why offenders commit their crimes. In reality, however, establishing motive is not always necessary to secure conviction. The central legal question is whether the available evidence proves that the defendant committed the charged offenses. In Robert Tyrone Hayes' case, investigators acknowledged that he never provided a complete explanation for his actions. Because of that silence, the precise motivation behind the murders could not be established through his own account. Nevertheless, investigators offered professional assessments based upon the available evidence. They concluded that sexual motivation did not appear to be the primary factor driving the murders. Instead, detectives believed that Hayes appeared to derive satisfaction from controlling his victims, with strangulation serving as the means through which that control was exercised. It is important to recognize the careful language used in these conclusions. Investigators presented them as informed assessments rather than proven facts. Since Hayes did not fully explain his actions, no one could state with certainty what he was thinking during the crimes. Responsible criminal investigation requires acknowledging the limits of available evidence rather than filling gaps with speculation. This distinction also reflects an important ethical responsibility in true crime storytelling. There is often a temptation to portray offenders as mysterious figures whose motives can be explained through elaborate psychological theories. In many real investigations, however, certainty is impossible because the offender never provides truthful or complete answers. Rather than invent explanations, investigators rely upon observable evidence and remain honest about what cannot be known. Hayes' case exemplifies that approach. The courtroom proceedings, therefore, centered not on dramatic psychological narratives, but on measurable facts. Biological evidence connected Hayes to the victims. Forensic analysis supported the conclusions reached by detectives. The preserved evidence from the original investigations retained its integrity despite the passage of nearly 14 years. Together, these elements created a case capable of meeting the legal burden required for conviction. The prosecution also highlighted one of the broader lessons emerging from the investigation: the extraordinary importance of preserving evidence even when a case appears stalled. Had detectives failed to safeguard biological material during the original investigations, later advances in DNA analysis would have been unable to identify Hayes. The years separating the murders from the prosecution did not diminish the value of that evidence. Instead, they demonstrated how patience and professional procedure can eventually produce results long after public attention has shifted elsewhere. For the families of the victims, the legal proceedings represented more than an examination of forensic science. They marked the first time the criminal justice system formally confronted the individual investigators believed responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. Although no verdict could erase years of grief or restore the lives that had been lost, the courtroom provided an opportunity for accountability that had seemed impossible during the long period when the murders remained unsolved. The proceedings also underscored the human cost of delayed justice. Nearly 14 years had passed between the murders and the identification of Hayes through DNA. During that time, families lived without answers, investigators carried unresolved cases, and the offender remained unidentified. The eventual prosecution did not eliminate those lost years, but it ensured that the evidence collected during the original investigations would finally receive the legal examination it deserved. By the conclusion of the trial, the case against Robert Tyrone Hayes rested upon the combined strength of preserved forensic evidence, modern DNA analysis, and the careful reconstruction of investigations that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved. The courtroom had become the place where years of scientific progress and investigative persistence converged. What remained was the court's final judgment, a decision that would determine Hayes' legal responsibility for the murders of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton, and bring one of Florida's longest unresolved serial murder investigations to its conclusion. After nearly 14 years of uncertainty, the investigation into the Daytona Beach murders finally reached the stage where evidence, law, and accountability would meet. For years, the names of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton had remained connected to unanswered questions. Their deaths had been investigated, their cases had been preserved, and their families had waited while the person responsible remained unknown. The identification of Robert Tyrone Hayes through DNA transformed the investigation. But the final measure of justice would depend on what could be proven in court. A suspect becoming known is only the beginning of a criminal case. The justice system requires more than suspicion. It requires evidence strong enough to establish responsibility beyond the legal standard required for conviction. In this case, investigators and prosecutors focused on the 3 murders for which the available evidence provided a clear connection: the deaths of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton. The evidence that had once been unable to identify the killer had now become the foundation of the prosecution. Through DNA analysis and the review of preserved forensic material, investigators established links between Hayes and the 3 confirmed Daytona Beach murders. These connections allowed the cases to move forward after years of remaining unresolved. The significance of this development extended far beyond the arrest of one individual. It represented the completion of a process that had begun at 3 separate crime scenes more than a decade earlier. The evidence collected during those early investigations had survived long enough for technology to reveal what investigators had always hoped to discover: the identity of the person responsible. During the legal process, the prosecution presented the evidence connecting Hayes to the murders. The DNA findings became the central element of the case because they provided scientific support, rather than relying solely on interpretation or witness memory. The investigation had been transformed from a search for an unknown offender into a prosecution, supported by forensic evidence. The importance of DNA in this case reflected the changing nature of criminal investigations. In previous decades, many cases depended heavily on eyewitness accounts, confessions, or direct physical observations. While those forms of evidence remain important, DNA has created new opportunities to solve crimes that once seemed impossible to resolve. The Daytona Beach investigation demonstrated how forensic science can provide answers even after many years have passed. The evidence did not appear suddenly. It had existed since the original investigations. What changed was the ability to analyze it. The court proceedings also highlighted an important distinction between confirmed crimes and suspected connections to other cases. As investigators examined Hayes' background, they considered whether he might have been responsible for additional murders beyond those already supported by evidence. One case reviewed during this broader examination involved the 2008 killing of Stacey Gage. However, investigators did not possess sufficient physical evidence to support criminal charges against Hayes for that homicide. This distinction remained important throughout the case. In public discussions of serial offenders, there is often a desire to connect every possible unsolved crime to a person who has already been convicted. However, criminal investigations cannot operate on possibility alone. Detectives may investigate potential links, but prosecutors must rely on evidence that can withstand legal scrutiny. For Hayes, the evidence supported convictions for 3 Daytona Beach murders. Other suspected connections remained separate because they did not meet the same evidentiary standard. This approach demonstrated the difference between investigative suspicion and courtroom proof. The purpose of a trial is not to answer every question surrounding an individual's life or every crime that may have occurred in the same region. Its purpose is to determine whether the evidence proves specific charges. By focusing on the 3 murders supported by forensic evidence, The prosecution presented a case based on facts that could be independently examined and verified. Ultimately, Robert Tyrone Hayes was convicted of the 3 confirmed Daytona Beach murders. The outcome brought a formal conclusion to the cases of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton. Hayes received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the severity of the crimes and ensured that he would remain in prison for the remainder of his life. For the families of the victims, the verdict represented a long-awaited moment of accountability. It could not undo the years of uncertainty. It could not restore the lives that had been taken. It could not erase the pain caused by the loss of their loved ones. But it provided something that had been absent for many years: a legal acknowledgement of responsibility. Justice in homicide cases is often described as closure, but the reality is more complicated. A conviction does not erase grief. It does not return victims to their families. It does not reverse the emotional impact of years spent waiting for answers. Instead, justice provides recognition. It confirms that the victims mattered, that their deaths were investigated, and that the person responsible was held accountable through the legal system. The conclusion of the Hayes case also revealed a broader issue surrounding crimes against vulnerable populations. The victims in this case were women whose lives placed them at increased risk of being overlooked. Their struggles with instability, addiction, homelessness, or sex work became part of the investigative challenge, not because their lives were less valuable, but because their circumstances made their disappearances more difficult to detect quickly. The long delay before resolution demonstrated the need for continued attention to cases involving marginalized victims. Every missing person deserves concern. Every homicide victim deserves investigation. The circumstances of someone's life should never determine the value placed on finding justice for them. The case also served as a reminder of the importance of forensic preservation. When Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton were murdered, investigators could not know whether the evidence collected would ever identify their killer. They preserved it because that was their responsibility. Years later, that decision became the reason justice was possible. The investigation proved that unanswered cases are not necessarily forgotten cases. Evidence can remain meaningful even when years pass. Technology can advance. New comparisons can become possible. A case that appears impossible today may become solvable tomorrow. Robert Tyrone Hayes' conviction ended one chapter, but questions remained. Investigators continued considering whether additional victims might exist, and Hayes remained a suspect in other cases where evidence had not yet reached the level required for prosecution. The difference between knowing someone may be connected to other crimes and proving that connection beyond a reasonable doubt remains one of the most important boundaries in criminal justice. The conviction of Hayes, therefore, represented both an achievement and a reminder of those limits. 3 families received answers. 3 murders reached a legal conclusion. But other unanswered questions remained outside the scope of the convictions. The story of the Daytona Beach serial killer is ultimately not only a story about an offender. It is a story about the victims whose lives were interrupted, the investigators who continued searching despite years of uncertainty, and the scientific advances that eventually revealed what had been hidden. The verdict demonstrated that time does not always protect those responsible for violent crimes. A person may avoid identification for years, but evidence preserved carefully can survive longer than the passage of time. In the end, Robert Tyrone Hayes was not discovered because of a confession or a dramatic public revelation. He was identified because the truth had been preserved quietly inside evidence collected years earlier. The justice system moved slowly, but it eventually reached the point where the evidence could speak clearly. For Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton, their stories were no longer only records in unsolved homicide files. Their names became part of a case that demonstrated the power of persistence, forensic science, and the commitment to seeking answers even when those answers take many years to find. The conclusion of the Robert Tyrone Hayes case did not simply mark the end of a criminal investigation. It represented the final chapter of a long and painful journey that began with three women whose deaths initially appeared to exist as separate tragedies. The murders of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton revealed the challenges faced by investigators when crimes involve victims who live on the margins of society, when witnesses are scarce, and when the person responsible understands how to remain hidden. The case also demonstrated the extraordinary ability of forensic science to bring answers to investigations that once seemed impossible to solve. More than anything, however, the story of a Daytona Beach serial killer remains a story about the victims and the importance of remembering their lives beyond the circumstances surrounding their deaths. In discussions of serial murder cases, attention often focuses heavily on the offender. The name of the killer becomes widely recognized, while the names of victims risk becoming secondary details in a larger narrative. But every homicide investigation begins with a person whose life was taken. Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton were not simply evidence in a criminal case. They were individuals whose deaths left behind pain, unanswered questions, and families who waited years for justice. Their circumstances made them vulnerable. But vulnerability does not make a person less deserving of attention, dignity, or justice. In fact, their case highlights why society must pay closer attention to people who are often overlooked. The investigation into the Daytona Beach murders exposed one of the most difficult realities in homicide cases involving marginalized victims. When a person has unstable housing, struggles with addiction, or lives outside traditional social structures, their disappearance may not immediately trigger the same response that occurs in cases involving individuals with predictable routines and strong public connections. This does not mean their lives matter less. It means that investigators may face greater challenges in reconstructing their final moments. The delay between disappearance and discovery can affect evidence. The absence of reliable witnesses can limit investigative options. The lack of immediate public awareness can give offenders more time before their actions are recognized as part of a larger pattern. The case of Robert Tyrone Hayes demonstrated how those circumstances can create opportunities for a predator. Investigators concluded that Hayes appeared to target women whose situations made them especially vulnerable. By selecting victims who were less likely to be immediately reported missing, he may have reduced the risk of early detection. This conclusion was not based on assumptions about the victims themselves, but on the investigative realities surrounding the cases. The women's circumstances created challenges for law enforcement, and those challenges contributed to the length of time it took before the offender was identified. The term sometimes associated with Hayes, monster of Florence copycat, also requires careful explanation. The comparison emerged from certain similarities in victim selection and hunting patterns, not from any proven connection between Hayes and the infamous Italian case. There is no evidence that Hayes studied, copied, or was influenced by the monster of Florence investigation. The comparison was primarily used by some writers, bloggers, and true crime communities to describe similarities in how vulnerable victims were selected and how crimes occurred in isolated environments. Understanding this distinction is important because true crime discussions can sometimes create connections that go beyond what evidence actually proves. Responsible storytelling requires separating confirmed facts from comparisons or interpretations. The evidence in the Hayes case was powerful because it did not depend on such comparisons. The investigation was solved through forensic science. DNA evidence created the link between Hayes and the Daytona Beach murders. The biological material collected years earlier became the foundation for identifying a person who had remained unknown for nearly 14 years. This outcome demonstrated one of the most important lessons in modern criminal investigation. Time does not necessarily destroy the possibility of justice. Evidence collected carefully and preserved properly can remain valuable even when a case appears inactive. Scientific methods continue developing, and those advancements can transform old evidence into new answers. The Daytona Beach investigation stands as an example of how cold cases can eventually move forward when technology catches up with unanswered questions. The case also demonstrated the importance of investigative patience. Detectives working on the original murders could not know when or even if a breakthrough would occur. They collected evidence because it was necessary. They preserved information because future developments might make it useful. They continued maintaining the investigation despite years without an arrest. That commitment became essential when DNA technology eventually provided the missing connection. Cold cases often depend on this type of long-term dedication. Success may not come quickly. Investigators may never receive immediate confirmation that their work will lead somewhere. But every properly documented piece of evidence creates the possibility that future investigators will have the opportunity to succeed. The conviction of Robert Tyrone Hayes brought legal accountability, but it also revealed the limitations of what the justice system can accomplish. A conviction cannot restore the lives lost. It cannot remove the suffering experienced by families during years of uncertainty. It cannot answer every question surrounding an offender's behavior. Even after Hayes was convicted for the 3 Daytona Beach murders, investigators continued examining whether additional victims might exist. Some possible connections remained unproven because available evidence did not meet the standard required for criminal charges. This reality reflects an important principle. Justice must be based on evidence, not assumption. While investigators may believe an individual is connected to additional crimes, the legal system requires proof. That standard protects the integrity of every investigation and every conviction. The broader impact of the Hayes case extends beyond one offender and 3 confirmed murders. It serves as a reminder that vulnerable victims require equal attention from law enforcement and society. Every missing person deserves to be searched for. Every homicide victim deserves a complete investigation. The circumstances of a person's life should never determine whether their disappearance receives urgency or whether their death receives justice. The case also highlights the continuing evolution of forensic science. DNA technology has changed the way investigators approach unsolved crimes. Cases once considered impossible can now be reopened with new possibilities. Evidence that seemed inconclusive decades earlier may become decisive when analyzed using modern methods. The story of the Daytona Beach murders demonstrates how scientific progress can give investigators tools that earlier generations could only imagine. Yet technology alone does not solve crimes. It requires careful evidence collection, professional investigation, and a commitment to preserving truth even when answers are not immediate. Without those foundations, DNA analysis would have had nothing to reveal. The eventual identification of Hayes was the result of multiple efforts working together across time. Investigators who processed crime scenes, professionals who preserved evidence, laboratories that developed improved analytical methods, and detectives who continued searching for answers. Looking back at the entire investigation, the most important lesson may be that victims should never become forgotten simply because solving their cases takes years. The passage of time does not reduce the importance of justice. The deaths of Laketta Gunther, Julie Green, and Iwana Patton remained significant long after public attention moved elsewhere. Their cases continued because investigators believed their lives mattered and because unanswered questions deserved answers. The story of a Daytona Beach serial killer is therefore not only about a man who committed terrible crimes. It is about the persistence required to confront those crimes, the science that eventually uncovered the truth, and the responsibility to remember the people whose lives were taken. In the end, Robert Tyrone Hayes was identified not because he chose to reveal himself, but because evidence preserved from the past eventually reached the future. Nearly 14 years after the murders began, science provided what time had failed to provide: a name, accountability, and a measure of justice. The case remains a reminder that even when the path to the truth is long, evidence can endure, investigations can continue, and the voices of victims can still be heard.